So my next few videos are all going to be centered around this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's such a fascinating illusion that we create things in the world, and there may not be things in the world at all. And so we see this most explicitly with the notion of the self. The self feels like a solid, stable thing. And then when we kind of tear it open a little bit and investigate it and really introspect, we realize that it isn't a thing at all. It's something that we're continuously inventing. So it's far more like a process or a verb than a solid, stable thing. And it may not be just a coincidence that Ian McGilchrist, who studied the left and right sides of the brain and wrote The Master and His Emissary and reviewed thousands and thousands of articles and came to the conclusion that there are no things. In fact, he was going to title his next book, There Are No Things in the Universe. Now, of course, this is a much older idea. It goes back, we could say, much, much further than the 70s. But Alan Watts actually began one of his lectures, There Are No Things in Reality. And so I want to go through a real simple exercise with color because it just gives you a feel for this. So take a very simple experience like staring at the color red. And it seems like red must be a thing. It seems like a pretty stable, solid thing out in reality. But when we take this apart, and this is one of the really important roles that neuroscience will play in all this because it helps us, it points to the illusion. And so from a neuroscience perspective, we can take the experience of color apart and we can find that it isn't a thing at all. It's literally no thing. And so, well, what is the experience about? So you're looking at the color red, and so we start to dissect this and we take it apart and we say, well, there's just wavelengths of light energy. And a wavelength is exactly what it sounds like. It's the distance between one peak and the next. And if you're looking at red, it's about 650 or 700 nanometers. And that's what defines red. And if it was a different wavelength, you'd experience a different color. So the light energy, the visible spectrum, is all of the same sort of thing. Of course, we don't know if it's a wave or a thing at all. Whatever it is, it has this property of wavelength, and that's what defines the experience of color. But when the color hits the back of the eye and starts this whole process, it first interacts with the cells at the back of the eye. And it's a mysterious process where energy in reality somehow gets transformed into the energy of the nervous system. So we're interacting with our environment in these really mysterious ways that when you read a textbook, it makes it sound like we understand how it happens. But we really don't know how light energy gets transformed into a signal that the brain can understand, but it does. And then this neurological signal, this neurological language of the brain, that signal is sent back to the thalamus, different part of the brain, and then eventually to the visual cortex. And then it actually goes to an area called V4, which is part of the visual cortex, that seems to be particularly involved in color. In fact, for many neuroscientists, they call it the color processing center. And this is reasoned backwards, because if you have damage to V4, suddenly the world goes from this beautiful spectrum of colors to suddenly black and white. And so it seems like the reasoning there is pretty strong. Something special is happening in V4 that gives rise to color. So we suspect, okay, let's take V4 apart. And what do we find? Well, the fascinating thing about all this is you don't find color. So you can take V4 apart and you can dissect it, and all you find are other cells and other interconnections and neurotransmitters. There's no color in V4. It's as colorless as anything else. And that's what's so fascinating about all this. And it's like that when you get into the neuroscience, you realize that we can dissect the brain all we want. And many people like myself will say, well, you can't find consciousness in the brain. Well, what can you find? Can you find feelings in the brain? Can you find even face, like if you're looking at someone's face, and there's another area, the fusiform face area, which is specialized to process faces. But of course, if you dissect that, you don't find faces. All you find are more cells. And so that really is a great pointer to ask, okay, well, if it's not in the brain, where is color? Where is this thing that we're looking for? That's our quest. We go around looking for things like consciousness. Will we find consciousness in the brain, like it's a gold or treasure to be found? And we can't find it, and we can't even find something as simple as color. So Where does that take us? Well, it actually is an important part of the process, because we discover that how else are you going to discover this illusion of misplaced concreteness unless you discover that there are no things to be found? So you go through the process of neuroscience, you discover that red isn't in the brain, blue isn't in the brain, none of these colors are in the brain, none of these feelings are in the brain. There's just cells. And yeah, there's 87 billion of them, and they are interconnected in complex ways that the thinking mind has no ability to comprehend. But you're still never going to find human experience in any of these brain cells. So that leads us to ask, well, how does this all happen? Where is the color red? And that's where we get to the question of consciousness. And that's where we get to what I think, the way Jackson Peterson put it, I think is fascinating. Who's watching the neuro show? So we've got all these brain states, but who's the experiencer of these brain states? And as far as I can tell, the only thing we can point to is another mystery: consciousness. And again, consciousness is the one that's watching. In the same way that consciousness observes your thoughts, and when you start to meditate, you can get good at this. You can realize that thoughts are very autonomous, and they're just kind of on their own, doing their own thing. And the same thing with emotions. They're doing their own thing. But then you can take that down to very basic sensory experiences. You're looking at the color red, and you discover that it's consciousness watching this neuro show. But it's a little bit more intimate than that. It's almost as if, again, there are no things, there are processes. But the cool thing about processes is that they're so interconnected. So even, and I think it was McGilchrist who put it this way with cells, when you get into a cell, it seems like, well, cell is a thing, right? And when you talk about neurons, well, neurons are things. They're information processing cells. Information, they're like little computers, things in our brain. But when you really get to that and analyze it in the proper way, you realize that these aren't things at all. They're processes. And the interesting thing about a thing is that a thing is disconnected and separate. A process is always interconnected with its environment. And so there's a figure ground relationship here where, if you really get into these figure ground illusions, you realize that the figure is intimately connected with the background. It's the background that gives rise to the figure. And that's what is happening with all things, at least things that we believe are things. They look like they're things, they look like they're separate, but they're really brought to life by the background. And in this case, the background that's giving rise to all these illusory figures, illusory things, is consciousness itself.